Okay, so in the first class of nominal yield with inflation expectations, part one, we talked about the first important way to deconstruct the bond yield so you can understand what is going on in the yield department. And we discussed how the Fed Reserve has to ensure the economy runs at a potential growth rate and doesn't overheat or slow down. They do this by in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. So the R star represents the equilibrium risk-free of real yields at which the economy runs. We use the bond market to see if things are expensive or cheap, more to follow on yields in the R star that the Federal Reserve uses. So we understand that yield tells us the value of stuff. Now, inflation expectations, the central banks and the Federal Reserve use this to measure where we are in the credit cycle. They obsess with it being at 2%. Why 2%? Because that's the line in the sand they use to measure where the economy is and what steps they need to take to get it back at 2%, whether we are inflated or deflated. It's pretty much the status quo. So when you look at the short-term yields, 2, 5, 10-year Treasury yields moving, you have to ask, is it the real yields or inflation moving it? Are they moving together or separate? And why? And then are the real yields above or below the R star? And how fast they are moving in that direction? And this will tell you as a trader or investor what cycle, what regiment we are in and what sectors you should be in versus what sectors you shouldn't be in. Okay, lastly, real interest rates were always in a secular decline trend long before the Fed Reserve or central banks were established. Why? Because real long-term yields fall within areas of productivity and effect more than monetary policy. And if you don't know what monetary policy is, it's interest rates, supply of money, and circulation of money, which is controlled by the central bank or the Fed, versus physical policy, which is it addresses taxation, government spending, which is usually ran by legislation. So, in conclusion, we talked about leverage, how much you borrow, how much you pay the lender in our credit based monetary system. And we use real interest rate and inflation expectations to understand the trend of the market regime we are in to forecast what monetary policies to expect and the equilibrium real rate are to know what sectors we should be in and whether it's a good time to buy a house, pay off debts, buy a car, or should we be saving? So in the next class, we'll talk about how we can find the R rate and how we use these yields in conjunction with it, and that will be the workshop part of this part.